Welcome to the Green Transition Show with me, Dr. Francis Tuokuu. We have been told by researchers, policymakers, and environmentalists that nature can protect us from climate change. But what if that promise is starting to break down? To answer this question, I have with me an esteemed researcher who will help us to dissect and answer this question. We have Professor Yaw Agyeman Boafo. Prof, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Francis. It's a pleasure to be on this show, which I think is a very innovative show, and I'm happy you've gotten a chance to bring me on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Prof and I have known each other for over 20 years. During my undergraduate studies at the University of Ghana, he was my teaching assistant. He was a teaching assistant, and so I worked under him as an undergrad. And so I'm happy that he's my friend, and we've stayed in touch all these years. And today he's on the Green Transition Show. So you are most very welcome to the show. Prof, I would like you to introduce yourself to our audience who are watching us live on Facebook. So we are live on Facebook, and we also upload the recorded version on YouTube. If you are new to the channel, we encourage you to subscribe to the Green Transition Show on YouTube so that we can bring you insightful conversations such as the one we've just started. So, Prof, introduce yourself to our audience.
All right. Again, thank you, Francis. I consider myself to be a sustainability scientist. I'm currently at the University of Ghana, and my work sits at the intersection of what we call climate change, ecosystems, and human livelihoods. But then again, beyond the title, I see myself as someone who's trying to make sense of how large-scale environmental change is quietly what I call reshaping everyday life, especially across the African, context. I say that because I've done some work outside of Africa. And so, this passion that I have is not something abstract. It's grounded in a lot of field experience. I can talk a bit about my work in northern Ghana, and I've worked with farming communities where, the farming calendar, something that farmers talk about as very predictable across generation, has become very unreliable. And, I mean, several times, I remember farmers would tell me, the rain used to come in March, but now we wait, we guess, we gamble, and we're not too sure. So there's uncertainty about agriculture. And again, as somebody who lives in Accra, I've lived in Accra, the capital city of Ghana, all my life. I've decided to take a lot of interest in work around extreme heat. And the work that I've been doing on extreme heat in the last couple of years, has shown that climate change is not just about floods and droughts, okay? I think that it goes also to look at some of what I'll call them invisible stress people go through daily, especially informal vendors in major markets like Makola or Dublushi or Medina. And Medina is somewhere that I live. They're exposed to high temperatures, for long hours of the day. And often they don't have any proper cooling systems or shade apart from umbrellas that they use. And so this, goes ahead to affect their productivity and even their dignity. And again, in some of my work in the coastal Ghana, communities around Keta, and many of these areas where the land is disappearing. The land that people have been farming on or people have been living on have been disappearing. Homes are being lost. Livelihoods are disrupted. And also their cultures are being eroded. And for me, I begin to look at all this deeply and I realize that these are key problems that are affecting people's existence. So just so that this is to put into context, the passion that I have, comes from all this. And science, from my science background also, it tells us that climate change is happening, but people's lived experiences also tells us another part of the story. So I know that science, but also look at people's lived experiences. And I hope that in the few years ahead, my work will bridge this gap and bring the issues in a more socially grounded and what I'll call practically relevant manner. So that's a bit about myself, Francis.
Yeah, thank you very much. So contrary to the view by many people that, academics are very theoretical, with what we just told us, it's very practical. It affects your work affects the everyday life of ordinary people, and that's very important. You mentioned a terminology, extreme heat. Many people may not understand what extreme heat is. So if you can explain extreme heat and also explain to us ecosystems and then nature-based solutions. What do these terms mean? So if you can explain these terms to our audience, that would be great, so that we'll start our conversation on that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I think it's an important question that you are asking, because we need to look at this from the very basic, level. Yes, I did mention extreme heat, and it's something that has become a major challenge in our spaces, in our cities, not just in our cities, but even in rural areas as well. But in terms of definition, it actually varies from location to location. What may be extreme heat in Ghana may not be extreme heat in the UK, because we are exposed to different levels of temperature, and our systems are used to different levels of. But in Ghana, for instance, during certain times of the year, or time of the year when we have a lot of dry season, let's say from November all the way to December, January, February, March, we have an average temperature of, let's say, 32 degrees Celsius. And 32 degrees Celsius it's okay. It's an average temperature, 31, 32, 33 degrees Celsius. That works for all of us. We've been living our lives on that, because as a Ghanaian, you may also know what we call the Hamatan period, where there's a lot of dry rain that comes through. So that temperature is normal. But in recent times, we are experiencing temperatures that are going to 34 to 35 degrees Celsius, which is becoming the average temperature. So what it means is that temperature is creating an environment where there's too much heat, or the hotness of the day is much higher, and even the evenings too becomes a bit higher than the normal one. So that's when we say it's an extreme heat situation. And this can be attributed to of course, the developing nature of our cities, where now we are creating more concrete, or infrastructure that is based on concrete, glass, all the buildings we are putting up, all this big infrastructure, without also making room for more nature, which we'll talk about as I'm moving on. And talking about nature, I think I will go to the other very basic explanation that I'm going to do. What is an ecosystem? And an ecosystem, because everything around our life is built around what we call an ecosystem. Okay, so let me make this simple. An ecosystem is essentially what we call a network of interactions, between living organisms. Okay, so we're looking at plants, we're looking at animals, we're looking at microorganisms, things that we don't see. There's a lot of stuff that we don't see that are still part of the broader ecosystem. And then we're also looking at, when we look at these different organisms, we're looking at their physical environment. When I say their physical environment, if you think about plants, animals, and microorganisms, they are found in our physical environment. And physical environment means what? We're looking at the soil, and we're looking at the water, we're looking at the air. These are the things that comes together. But rather than thinking of ecosystems as what I'll call, sometimes think of it as a static entities like a forest or a river, okay? It's more accurate to think of it as a functional system that performs certain services for both humans and non-humans, okay? Say, for example, the forests that we have, or forests, they help to regulate rainfall patterns. At the same time, they help to store carbon, or trees that we have. And at the same time, they help to stabilize the soil, because in the forest, you have different kinds of root systems that move on. That's very important. You may have also heard about wetlands, and wetlands are areas within certain, part of our community that is basically a lot of water, sometimes with different kinds of herbs. These, by nature, they are important because they help to absorb water. Okay, and helping to absorb water means that it can eventually help to reduce flood, because if you have wetlands, an area that has a lot of water that also has other things, they help to reduce the amount of water that generally will just flow away like that. So wetlands are also a kind of ecosystem. And I'll mention two other things, like mangroves. Okay, mangrove vegetations are usually vegetation that are found along the coast. So the relationship between the coast and land, usually there's a lot of very good vegetation that is there. Those vegetations are authentically, meant to dissipate wave energy from the coast to land. And so it's like more like a block. And those vegetations are very important as well, and they perform very, very good functions. Apart from, of course, professional, they also give, value to people. And then in the northern regions, for instance, or in the semi-arid regions of Ghana and many other places, we have, grassland vegetation. I mean, Francis, from your background, for instance, you know that the grassland vegetation, it provides us with different services. But one of the very common ones is that, for example, it supports grazing systems for animals, which are also important for different purposes. So these are some of the things that we refer to as ecosystems that we have an environment on daily basis. And let me look at the last terminology, since our discussion actually, borders around this very important one as well. And that's what we call the nature-based solutions, okay? And these are all connected, closely connected. But when we say nature-based solutions, we look at them as what are called intentional interventions that use ecosystems, okay, to address, generally we say, to address societal challenges or challenges that faces society, okay? So instead of, let's say, relying solely on human engineered solutions, we design strategies that maybe harness ecological processes. The ecological processes that I just mentioned about the ecosystem, the forests, the wetlands, the mangroves, those are natural. But the question is that if we want to be able to harness them, then they become part of the solution that we also introduce. So let me give maybe one or two concrete examples, okay? So instead of building only concrete seawalls, especially in the coastal communities where they are faced with erosion or sea level rise, instead of building just concrete seawalls, which is happening, you can restore mangroves to also help to reduce the storm surges that are being experienced. And earlier on, I mentioned the importance of the mangrove in Accra. So that's a form of nature-based solutions. So even if humans have destroyed the mangrove, we have to find a way to restore them so that in addition to the concrete seawall, they help to also, do some sort of protection. And then, like we are seeing in our cities, for instance, instead of also, let's say, expanding the drainage systems that we are calling for every day, or we need drainage systems, another thing you can do, or which we need to do, is that we need to protect and restore the wetlands in our cities. Because the wetlands, from evidence, a lot of data show that they can absorb all the excess water that we have. So even if we had wetlands in our communities, it wouldn't be a bad thing. Then one very important one, because agriculture is very key. So instead of, let's say, relying purely on chemical inputs or fertilizer, which we've been doing a lot nowadays, you have to make sure that you integrate trees into your farming systems. And this is what we call agroforestry, okay? Because trees, for their different values that they have, they work the soil, they protect us from the wind, they also help with pollination. There's several purposes. The birds come in, and so they help to improve this and help to really generally do that. And I think this is something that is very important that we need to do. So these are some of the key definitions that, at least in simple terms, I can put out for my audience. Thank you.
Yes, so it means this is very important. It means that nature-based solutions play important or critical roles in helping address the climate crisis that we are in now. And climate change, as we know, is the most topical issue in the 21st century. Well, it affects all of us. It affects all aspects of human endeavor, whether social, political, economic, or environmental. If you are watching us, this is the Green Transition Show with me, Dr. Francis Tuokuu. Our guest is Professor Yaw Boafo. He's with the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability Studies at the University of Ghana. If you have not subscribed to the channel on YouTube, kindly do so that we'll continue to bring you insightful conversations. You can also follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and TikTok as well. You can comment on our videos, give us feedback so that we'll improve and continue to bring you insightful conversations. So, Prof, what happens when climate extremes? You talked about extreme heat. So what happens when climate extremes push ecosystems beyond their limits?
All right. Yes, again, this is a good question because when we speak about ecosystems protecting us, okay, we are really talking about their ability to absorb shocks without what I call losing their function. Or if I don't want to use the word shocks, I could use a disturbance or a stress. And science tells us that this ability is not infinite. And even like human beings, it's not infinite. I will cite a very important report because as a climate scientist, this is very important. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its sixth assessment report, is very clear on this particular point that you are raising, because it raises a point that says that multiple ecosystems are already approaching what we call critical thresholds. And particularly under a warming, when we say a warming, we look at a situation whereby our world is warming beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. What that means in practical terms is that systems that we once relied on for stability are becoming unstable themselves. Okay, so there was this other, in the same IPCC report, State Assessment Report, it notes that 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in contexts that are very highly vulnerable to climate change. Partly because the systems they depend on are degrading. And we are seeing that on daily basis. The same report also highlights that the frequency and intensity of what we call extreme events, extreme event in this case will be heat, or heavy rainfall and drought. They have increased across most regions of the world. And that is reducing ecosystems recovery capacity. I think about 2, 3 years, or was it Bangladesh also, when it rained for just about a couple of hours, the whole city was flooded. So when extremes, to these climate, issues intensify, what I think happens is that ecosystems experience what we call a functional breakdown. A functional breakdown occurs generally. And so one example we could look at is that a wetland does not just struggle, it loses its capacity to be able to absorb flood waters. Because if you look at wetlands, let's say in Accra, the city where I live, they've all been almost totally destroyed. So it becomes difficult. In the same way, I think there's a study that the World Bank has done, and the World Bank study reinforces this particular point that the IPCC makes, and it also shows that natural systems are being degraded faster than they can regenerate. And so, especially in the low-income and middle-income countries like Ghana and many parts of Africa. And so this is something that I think we need to look at carefully. But Francis, let me actually translate this into a very simple but powerful idea, okay?
Sure.
I think I did mention that nature is not designed for unlimited stress. Once pushed beyond its limits, it stops protecting, and then it starts exposing itself. It's just like, even if humans are nature, and in the same way, nature in the form of plants happen, that is something that happens. So that's something that we need to be paying attention to. And I think, for me, another critical issue is what we call the loss of recovery time, and that has been mentioned a lot, because historically, what we've seen from different parts of the world is that ecosystems could recover between disturbances. If you look at some part of the world where they've experienced cyclones, they've experienced, there was a way that they could recover after a few years. But today, climate extremes are happening more rapidly, in rapid succession. Unlike maybe in the past, you have in like 10 years, you have one cyclone. But now, almost every year, we are experiencing cyclone, and this is being documented. And if you look at flooding, for instance, in northern Ghana, where a lot of my work has happened over the years, drought is followed regularly every year and by a heat wave or extreme heat, and that is a problem. Unlike the past, maybe once 10 years we have some major drought, or then we talk about it, but that is something that is becoming more and more. So it is not just that climate shocks are more stronger. It is that I think that they are arriving faster than nature can recover, and that to me is a problem. That's why we need to be reflecting more on how we are dealing with nature. Yeah.
I know you've talked about flooding, droughts, across the world in some areas, but can you share specific examples, either from Ghana or other African contexts, where nature has succeeded or failed to provide protection?
Oh, yes, I'm very happy to talk about this, because in practice, that's what my work has been on. And then, so let me start with where nature is still working, okay? Because it's important to look at what is happening. And in coastal Ghana, where I mean, there remain some areas where nature still works, and they continue to reduce the wave energy that typically, affects people. Some studies that have been done by some of my colleagues, even here at the University of Ghana, fisheries and marine science, across West Africa, it shows that, mangroves can reduce wave height by up to, let's say, 60 to 80% over relatively short distances. And these are all depending on what we call the density and the width of those mangroves. And so this is why, they are often promoted as natural coastal defense systems. And this is what it's been done, I mean, along the coastline of West Africa, I mean, from Ghana, Ivory Coast, Senegal, Liberia, and that is something that has been shown. So it works. Of course, in some other areas, there may be challenges. So let's still stick to the things that are working. Then even in northern Ghana, for instance, where, I spoke earlier on about agroforestry system, ensuring that you have, trees in your farm system. Agroforestry systems have demonstrated some resilience benefits. Resilience means that they've been able to help restore certain kinds of livelihood and systems. Because studies that have been done have shown that farms that integrate trees can improve the soil moisture retention and then reduce the yield variability and even erratic rainfall regimes. And this is something that is common in many other parts of Africa. If you go to even Mali or Burkina Faso, there's some good amount of studies that have been done by WASCA, that have been done by other universities that shows that, because people keep trees on their farms, they are better able to, restore the degraded land, and they can particularly be helpful in ensuring that, things are working well. There's also some other at the global scale, let's say some of the World Bank estimates, it shows that coastal wetlands, for instance, they they provide more than, let's say, 65 billion annually in avoided flood damages. Okay, avoided flood damage, because if the wetlands were not there, they're likely to have a lot of damages. But because those areas have wetlands, they've been able to avoid all the potential damages that will come to people. And so this is not just theoretical. These are actually measurable protections that World Bank has put in place that we are seeing in different parts of the world. So nature does work, and we are seeing that. I mean, one of the basic examples is when you feel hot in any part of the city and you find yourself in a garden. Unfortunately, we don't have too many gardens in our cities in Ghana. You realize that the temperature just cools down. I mean, several times when over here at my University of Ghana, when I feel hot and I move towards the botanical garden, you just feel like a sense of calm. So that's something that we need to be paying attention. Nature does work. But your other part of the question about the failures, yes. I think the failures are becoming more and more visible, and that's why it's becoming a concern. We are talking about it more and more. I mean, take Accra, for instance. Okay, Francis, we know that in urban wetlands, particularly within in Accra, there's what we call the Odo Basin. Odo is a river which is supposed to run through, and within the center of the city. Urban wetlands are supposed to be joining and interlinking them. Historically, those wetlands, the Sakumo, the Pond, they've served as flood buffers, and I mentioned that. But today, due to encroachment or waste dumping, and again, weak planning enforcement, these systems are degraded. And if that's the case, what is happening? I think the consequences are clear. Okay, we are seeing more increased floods in Accra. Ashalbotre last year or so, a whole area which is, a well-designed estate area, the whole area got flooded, many communities. And that also will mean that more flooding means greater damage to infrastructure, high exposure of vulnerable people. In our cities, there's a lot of people who are vulnerable because they don't have the means to live in houses that can protect them. So these are also things that we need to be paying attention to. Again, Francis, this is not just some sort of anecdotal evidence that I'm putting across. This is something that has been identified at different levels. The World Bank, the metropolitan assemblies, they have evidence of flooding in our cities. And these are also not driven only by rainfall intensity, but what I would call also a loss of the natural drainage systems or the degradation of our ecosystems. And wetland degradation is one of them. And the pollution of our water bodies is one of them. So flooding in our cities, again, is no longer just a climate problem. I want the audience to understand that. It is also the failure to protect the ecosystems that once managed water for us. Okay, so that's something that I think is very important. Maybe one more example that I don't want to forget that if you consider coastal erosion in a place like Keta and its surrounding environment, there's some communities known as Fuveme, and I've done some work there. I've published recently on the social cultural implications. In those areas, mangroves often, cited or became very important for protection. But the reality is even more complex over there now, because when erosion rates are extremely high, and then the sediments that are supplying, the area is disrupted, mangroves cannot keep up the pace, and that's the problem. The connection in the area that I'm talking about, you can go historically back to the construction of the Akosombo Dam, which led to a lot of change in the flow of the river. And then if you look at Ada, they've all contributed to the disruption of that area's sediment flow. So in some areas within this area that I'm talking about, shoreline retreat has exceeded several meters per year. And there's some very good studies that Dr. Jason Kwashida, a colleague of mine here at the University of Ghana, has done, and that has become overwhelming for the natural defenses. And that's what I want us to be paying attention to, because again, even beyond Ghana or Keta, across Africa, we've seen similar dynamics. Okay, we've seen that, and that is something that is repeating itself in Southern Africa. If you take away even coastal issues, we know that repeated droughts have reduced river flows and wetland functionality, and we know Southern Africa in recent times have become very prone to water shortages. And so this is something that I think we have to look at beyond just Ghana or even Africa.
I'm enjoying the conversation and I'm learning a lot from the examples you are citing. But based on what you've just said, don't you think we are over-relying on our ecosystems for protection? And granted that that is the case, what are the limitations of relying too much on our ecosystems for climate, to protect us against, climate change or climate resilience?
Okay. Yeah, okay. So let me start by they are powerful, but they are not sufficient on their own. That's something that I need to, clarify. And the problem is not the concepts, okay? The problem is how we are currently relying on it, okay? There
Yes.
are a few fundamental, what I call mismatches that explain why this is the case, okay? The very first one is what we call it the time mismatch. Okay, time is much because nature tends to work very slowly. Nature by itself, it works slowly. But climate change is moving very fast. Every day there's some evidence of how climate change impact is occurring. So let's take something like mangrove restoration. Okay, when mangrove is fully established, mangroves can, let's say, significantly reduce what I call the wave energy. Sometimes, some of the studies say sometimes over 60%, it can reduce the wave energy, and this is well documented by several studies. But those protective functions only come when the system is matured, and that can take about 10, 15, or even 20 years. So meanwhile, coastal flooding and sea level rise are accelerating now as we speak on a daily basis. And we saw this clearly. And I remember those were my early times as actually, I was yet to even finish my undergrad, but I saw it because there was some news on CNN at that time. We saw this after the 2004 tsunami in Indonesia. In that particular tsunami, there was a massive push to restore mangroves. But many of those projects struggled, either because they were planted in the wrong places or simply because the ecosystems have not matured enough to protect, or to enhance the protection of the people. So you begin to ask the question, or maybe the key issue, or see the tension here. We're asking that we do what we call slow growing system to solve fast moving problems. It's something that comes up. And then, but I bring this example because during that particular tsunami, there was some evidence of certain areas within the Aceh Island that were not destroyed by the tsunami because of the availability of what we call the mangroves that were there. So the timing is very important, and that's one of the issues that I think we need to look at. The time mismatch. Then the other part is the issue of what we call the scale. The scale mismatch is also, another way to say that most nature-based interventions are too small. They're either pilot, projects, or they're either community-level initiatives. A few hectares and there. But climate risks are often operating at a very high level. Okay. And one example that I can think about, so let's even think about the Amazon, for instance, which is well known. Scientists have been warning that part of the Amazon has been approaching a tipping point. The Amazon is huge, just so that we put it in context. It's like many countries. But we are looking at a situation whereby the forests that are in the Amazon are moving from a more typical forest and they are shifting to like a savanna-like forest because of the kind of stress that we have put on it. Now, if you are restoring small patches of forest while also losing some elsewhere, and then, I mean, the math does not work. Because if people are doing that, it doesn't really work. So the same applies even in our cities. Okay, in our cities, I think there's an example that I'll use because if you look at Jakarta, Indonesia, Jakarta, for instance, mangroves have been restored along the coast, which is very good. But the city is also sinking due to what we call groundwater extraction, and the sea levels are rising. So the government is now investing more in what they call massive sea walls. And this is not bad. Why is it not bad? Because they can't rely alone on nature. And so earlier on, I did make a statement that yes, nature is important, but you can't just rely on it alone because of the extremity of the hazard that we're experiencing from climate change. So that is very important. So just so that the audience understand, we can't just solve a system scale problem with the project scale solutions. I always use that expression. A system scale problem is such that it brings different components. So if you just want to do one project or this project, it won't solve it. So we need to have a way to, bring together, this issue. The third issue that we need to look at in response to your question is that I think it's often overlooked because people don't pay too much attention. But this is what I'll call the pressure mismatch. The pressure mismatch because nature-based solutions are being implemented in an environment where, in most cases, economic and then land use pressures are also actively working against them. Yeah. If you take even take Brazil, recently I read a paper. They have very impressive efforts of what we call them in the part of the country that are looking at trying to restore or do reforestation. But at the same time, there's also what we call large scale agricultural expansion. First of all, for soya and for cattle. And this, even cocoa, okay? And even in Brazil is a country that is known for biofuel a lot. So, and these are also continue to drive deforestation. So as they are doing this, at the same time, there's also, so it's more like basically not doing nothing. So when you restore in one place, you are losing in another place. So then what is the point? And when we come down to Africa, in East Africa, for instance, I mean, I did travel to some parts of Kenya and Nanyuki, and over the rangeland areas, huge areas of vegetation. Restoration is something that has shown some success because it allows vegetation to return in areas that have been degraded for time. But then there's also the issue of grazing pressures that are increasing, and again, people are also moving into these areas. And so when that happens, it's like, again, you're not doing much and even in Ghana, we see this very clearly because we spoke about wetlands being very critical buffers, but we know very well that all the wetlands, and just last month, almost every week, people have been moved from wetlands in the Sakumo, and this is something that's happening for housing. And so it's happening, and we look at another context like forest reserves. We know forest reserves exist all over the country. From the north to the south to the east, there are forest reserves all across the country. Those are supposed to be buffers, but we know that illegal logging is destroying or continuing to do that, and even mining is also continuing. So for us, the issue is not just that nature cannot work. It is what we are creating, or it is the condition that we are not creating for it to work. Because I still believe, and as somebody who is very much in tune with nature, I think that nature cannot protect us if the systems around it are constantly undermining it. And a last point that I'll speak about before you come in is also, and maybe perhaps the more concerning one is that, there's a lot of uncertainty now. There's uncertainty under the extreme conditions because many nature-based solutions are designed are based on ecosystems behavior in the past. But because climate change is pushing us into conditions that we have not seen before, it's becoming a problem. And a very good example that is a more global that I can talk about. If you take coral reefs, very beautiful, colored, ecosystems that are found under the sea. These are they're not just beautiful for fun. Okay, they act as what we call natural breakwaters. So they also help to reduce wave energy and protect the coastlines. They also are important for, spawning grounds for fish and all that stuff. But again, the data that the IPCC has projected shows that if you look at 1.5 degrees of warming, we're going to lose more than 70 to 80% of coral reefs. And that is very, very disturbing. Okay, because in Australia, where they have the Great Barrier Reef, or even the small island developing countries, they're all going to be gone if that is going to happen. And so I think that's something that we need to worry about. And so again, the underlying issues are becoming much clearer. And I think for me, we are designing solutions for climate change that no longer exists. And that's why it's something that we need to be worried about.
Yeah. If you are watching us, this is the Green Transition Show with me, Dr. Francis Tuokuu. Our guest is Professor Yaw Agyeman Boafo. He's with the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability Studies at the University of Ghana. If you are watching us for the first time, we encourage you to subscribe to our channel on YouTube, follow us on TikTok and LinkedIn, as well as on Facebook. We are currently live on Facebook. Prof, you talked about failures, how ecosystems can fail us or can fail to protect us, and what we are doing to exacerbate those failures. Now, I want us to focus on governance. How do governance failures affect the effectiveness of nature-based solutions?
Okay.
Government definitely has a role in these failures we are talking about. Government has played a role. You talked earlier on about improper planning or lack of planning or proper planning.
Yeah.
And lack of proper planning falls under the doorsteps of government. So how has governance failures contributed to all of these things?
Yeah. Thank you, Francis. I think ultimately that is where the buck stops. I mean, governance failures. And again, governance is in many ways the key, or what I'll call the make or break factor here. Okay. You can have, let's say, the best ecological idea, but if the governance system is weak or fragmented or even misaligned, the solution will not hold. And my readers should expect something that I'm looking at. I'm publishing in the coming months on fragmented governance systems. And so let me break this down in a more practical sense, okay? Because first, there's the issue of what we call the institutional fragmentation. In many countries, I mean, including Ghana, responsibility for ecosystem is spread across multiple agencies, okay? Usually it may be spread across the forestry agencies or the environment agencies, agriculture, urban planning, and then even water resources, just to mention, some of these key ones. I mean, each operates within its own mandate, often with limited coordination. So then what happens? One agency promotes, let's say, wetland protection. Another approves the land development in the same area. So what happens? The system contradicts itself. So nature-based solutions do not fail in isolation, they fail in a fragmented system. And that's where one of the key issues is that we need to be paying attention to. So that's the very first layer, those fragmented. Then comes, the second one, which is what we call the issues of enforcement, Francis. And as people who live in the global south, we know these are things that are not magic. Because we know that policies often exist on paper. In Ghana, we have so many policies existing on paper. Implementation is where the things break down. Because take urban flooding in Accra again, which I've mentioned. We know wetlands are important. At least if you didn't know, today, based on my discussion, we've said that.
Yes.
We know that building in waterways, what happens? It increases risk. And there's regulations that exist on this, but the enforcement is inconsistent. So over time, the system basically, that's why it just degrades. Not because we like the knowledge, we don't like the knowledge, but because we like the institutional follow through. I mean, that is needed. And I tend to bring some World Bank word because if you look at the way we get funds from World Bank for different purposes, the World Bank has constantly highlighted that in many countries in the global south, issues of weed governance and enforcement are among what we call the biggest barriers to effective climate adaptation. Often more than even the technical limitations, because increasingly we have technical skills to be able to do this. So that's the biggest challenge that we faced. And I don't think anybody here will come to, or there's someone here listening or viewing today who will say this is not true. And then there's also the other point about the top-down design, okay? But this is where I have a lot of problem with. I have problems with all what I've highlighted, but the top-down design is also a major concern because many nature-based solutions are designed externally by government or sometimes by donors, including the World Bank themselves and technical experts. And when implemented in communities with limited involvement, the result is what? Low ownership. And I've seen that through some of my work all across, some of my district vulnerability assessment. We also have poor maintenance. And even if there's low ownership and poor maintenance, what happens? The thing fails. So we have seen cases where tree planting initiatives simply fail because communities are not involved in selecting the species of trees or even managing the process. Green Ghana, I think this government hasn't continued anyway, but the point is that's something that we've been doing. We did it for about a number of years, 4, 5, 6 or something years. Can we tangibly say that we've seen the impact, or we've been able to manage the Green Ghana, the impact in many communities in Ghana? So I think that if communities are treated as beneficiaries instead of partners, nature-based solutions become short-lived interventions, and we've seen that everywhere that we go. You plant trees everywhere before you realize there's nothing happening. You go in 2 years' time, and yet it's gone. So I think that is very important. And I think another point is, and I think this is also an issue of what I call equity and access. And equity is important in this era of sustainability, sustainable development, and all that. Because who really benefits from nature-based solutions? Okay? That's something that we need to understand. And then who also bears the cost? This is where things become more complex. You have the question, who benefits and who bears the cost? Let's look at, let's say, urban greening projects. We know that urban greening projects, something I'm passionate about, is to improve environmental quality, but it can also increase what we call property values. And this can lead to displacement of low-income residents in many parts of our cities. And this is the term that we call the word green gentrification. Gentrification was a word that came up many years ago, taking people from where they live because the rich can afford to buy their land and use them into nice. This is green gentrification. And so large scale, conservation project for us, and that happens in many parts of our communities. They usually attract a lot of international funding. But Francis, we see that local communities, they see little of the benefit. They don't see much. Everything is at the highest level. So my point is that if these are not carefully designed, if the projects are not carefully designed, nature-based solutions can actually reinforce inequality. And one point that I also make sometimes to my students is that a solution that protects ecosystems but marginalizes, let's say, people is not a solution. It's simply a redistribution of the risk. And that's something that we need to be actually paying attention to carefully.
So what will a truly integrated approach to climate resilience look like?
Okay. I think at this point, we have to move beyond what I'll call the false choice, okay?
Yeah.
It is not, I say a false choice because it is not nature versus, let's say, infrastructure, okay? Or in other words, it is not necessarily, let's say, it is not ecology versus engineering, okay? I think the future of climate resilience or the future of us dealing with climate change and ensuring that we're able to go about our lives, it lies in what is called integration, or sometimes we use the word hybrid. It lies in integration, and that's where we begin to design systems where ecosystems, built infrastructure, and institutions work together. We need that. This is very important. So a truly integrated approach, it recognizes something that is very simple. It says that nature reduces risk, infrastructure can help to manage risk, and then institutions then comes to coordinate both. Okay, and there are several examples. I mean, to what I'm trying to say, the most famous example will be Singapore. Okay, Singapore is a very good example because this is a what they call a highly urbanized, densely populated city-state. Think about a city-state with very limited land. It's a beautiful story that people need to pay attention and listen to. Yet Singapore has deliberately, integrated nature into its urban planning, not as a decoration, but as a functional infrastructure. Recently, I think last year, if I got it right, the president of Ghana was in Singapore, and I think he took along some people to study their case study. I hope that we can learn from it and then be able to do that. So, through that example, they have some things like they have this concept that they use, very nice one called a city in a garden, or even now they call it a city in nature strategy that they have. It's online, people can look at it. And through that particular strategy, urban parts are connected into ecological networks, water bodies and all that stuff. That's something that is very clear. Then also, I know that drainage systems are redesigned as what we call green-blue corridors. You don't just have huge gutters or huge concrete drainage systems that's very important. They have a reservoir like I'm not sure the exact name, but it's called Bishan and Monkey. It's something that it's a park. So they've transformed it from a concrete canal into what they call a naturalized river system that absorbs flood waters, in the city. So instead of just building higher concrete walls, as we are seeing, Francis, we are seeing this in our city now. Everywhere you go, they are building concrete walls all over the city, hoping that, but that is not the only solution. I think the example that Singapore has done is something we can learn from even now. We don't need to make the same mistakes that we've made in the past. Because I think from what I've read about the Singapore's case, Singapore did not choose nature infrastructure. It's just decided to redesign infrastructure to behave like nature. So that synergy is important. We can go also to the Netherlands, which is a famous country because, historically, they tell you that Netherlands has been underwater. Even as we speak now, it's a country that's purely living, below sea level. So the approach was what? To control water. And they've been evolving in terms of they've been changing technologies. The whole very traditional approach of the dikes, there's the embankment or the barriers. They've done massive engineering, systems that has helped them to live, within the water. So how many times have you heard that people in Amsterdam are drowning or something like that? Yet they have a lot of water within their spaces. And I think that's something that we can look at carefully. There are several examples, I mean, around the world that we can pinpoint to look at it. But if we bring it down to, let's say, to Ghana, I think the implications are very clear, Francis. You know, if you take flooding in Accra, I just want to say that the solution is not just in restoring our wetlands or expanding our drainage systems as we are doing. It is both. It is both plus what? Law enforcement, and then also waste management. We need to manage our waste very carefully. And then also strengthening early warning systems. Early warning system is very important. And if you move from the coast to the northern regions as well, you know, the example that I talked about, some good case studies of agroforestry being combined with, you know, irrigation, or farmers being given, you know, good information on climate change, and even more importantly, institutional support. These are very important that we need to be paying attention to.
Yeah. So, Prof, what are your final words? I certainly have enjoyed this conversation, and I believe our audience have enjoyed it as well. And we've learned a lot throughout the show. What are your final words?
All right. So, thank you, Francis. Let me say that, you know, for a long time we have spoken about nature as if, I mean, I think we make it look like nature sits outside of us, something that, you know, we can turn to when things go wrong. But what this conversation has shown, and I believe is I mean, my intention was that nature is not backup plan. Okay, let's not think of nature as just a backup plan. It's actually the foundation on which everything else exists. And in my biodiversity class, I teach students, you know, obviously, when you know what it means, our lives as humans depend on what biodiversity gives us. And so right now, that foundation is under strain. It's very much under serious strain. And if you look at it across Ghana, some of the examples that I gave, you know, and even in other parts of Africa, the wetlands are disappearing, you know, the forests are becoming thinner, and the coastlines are eroding, you know, the coastlines all over, temperatures are rising, people are complaining. And each one of these systems weakens, you know, our ability to go about with our daily activities. Our food systems are becoming weaker, our health systems are becoming weaker, you know, livelihood systems. So the question is not simply, you know, whether nature can still protect us. I think the deeper question is whether we are still acting in the way that allow it to. So because every decision we make today, how we build, how we farm, or how we consume, how we govern, either strengthens, you know, or goes ahead to weakens nature. So I just want to live by, you know, saying that if we continue to weaken it, we will find ourselves, you know, trying to replace it, and that will be more expensive. Okay, that will be more expensive. So what what I think we need to do more is look at integrating it into the way we go about our development, how we consume, everything we do. Because it's important to say that nature has not stopped protecting us, Francis. It has not. It's more or less like we have started disconnecting from the systems that make the protection possible as human beings. And so perhaps, I mean, more importantly, I think that for climate resilience, as somebody who teaches climate change, it will not be determined by what nature can do. It's more like it's what we choose to do with nature, starting from our everyday actions, everyday small actions. Of course, the national level actions are important, but that's where we need to be looking at carefully, okay? Because ultimately, this is not just a policy issue. I think I'll end by saying that, Francis, it's the responsibility issue. It is everybody, everywhere, and we need to look at it from that point of view. Don't expect somebody to, you know, tell you what to do or not to do. So this is a responsibility issue, and we all can play a role in addressing these issues. So thank you.
Yes. So I like your conclusion. It's a responsibility issue. All of us have a role to play in addressing our climate change concerns and ensuring that our nature continues to protect us. This is where we'll draw the curtain to a close. We thank Prof so very much for such an insightful depth of knowledge on nature-based solutions and also on climate change. we encourage our viewers who have not subscribed to our channel on YouTube to do so, to continue to encourage us to bring more insightful conversations such as this. You can follow us on TikTok, LinkedIn, and also on Facebook. The next episode will be on Tuesday, and we'll talk about something very interesting as well. So, Prof, thank you once again for joining the show. We really appreciate your time and insights.
Thank you very much, Francis, and all the best.
Thank you.